Together we stand! Ubrail!
The hammer fell, iron sang. In the heart of the Cascade Mountains, winter did not arrive with a whisper. It came like a starving wolf, tearing at the timber of the roof, howling through the cracks in the heavy log walls. But inside the forge there was only the heat, the glowing coals, and the steady, solitary rhythm of a man keeping his ghosts at bay. Gideon brought the hammer down again. Sparks showered across his heavy leather apron, dying as they hit the dirt floor. He was 32, but his eyes belonged to a much older man. They were the color of rusted earth, shadowed by a quiet, immovable weight. He turned the steel with his tongs, his jaw tight. It was his left hand that held the metal to the anvil. The skin there was a road map of ruined tissue. Thick, pale scar tissue crawled from his knuckles, wrapping around his wrist and disappearing beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his flannel shirt. When the mountain cold seeped through the walls, the scars ached, a deep phantom throbbing. A reminder of the heat, a reminder of the fire. He raised the hammer. He struck. The rhythm was a prayer he didn't believe in anymore. Suddenly a sound broke the pattern of the storm. It wasn't the wind snapping a pine branch. It was a heavy, wet thud against his solid oak door, a desperate weight collapsing. Gideon stopped. He lowered the hammer. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his right arm. He picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he moved to the door. He unlatched the heavy iron bolt. The wind threw the door open, driving a blinding sheet of white snow into his face. The cold hit the heat of the forge like a physical blow. At his boots, a figure lay face down in the snowdrift. Gideon knelt, the wind tearing at his clothes. He grabbed the figure by the shoulder and rolled them over. His breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, but not like any woman he had ever seen. She was massive, taller than his own 6 feet, with a broad, powerful build, encased in shattered plates of dark, unfamiliar armor. But it wasn't the armor that made him freeze. It was her skin. Beneath the dirt and the ice, her skin was the color of a bruised evening sky, a deep ashen violet. Her hair was a wild, tangled mane of spun silver, matted dark with blood. And the blood pooling in the white snow was not red. It was a thick, iridescent indigo. Her right hand was locked in a death grip around the hilt of a massive sword. The weapon was as tall as a man, forged from a dark metal that pulsed with a faint, dying blue light. She was dying. Her breathing was ragged, shallow gasps that barely moved her chest. Gideon did not look around to see who had done this to her. He didn't care what war had spilled onto his doorstep. A wounded creature was bleeding out in the freezing dark. That was the only fact that mattered. He didn't speak. He reached down and pried her long frozen fingers from the glowing hilt of the sword. The metal felt strangely warm against his scarred palm, but he pushed it aside into the doorway. He slid his arms under her shoulders and beneath her knees. She was incredibly heavy, dense with muscle, and the weight of the strange steel armor, but Gideon's back was built from a lifetime of shaping iron. He hoisted her against his chest. He carried her inside, kicking the heavy oak door shut against the howling dark, sliding the iron bolt back into place. He laid her down on the thick bare rug in front of the stone hearth. He threw 3 more logs onto the fire, watching the flames roar to life, casting dancing orange shadows across her alien features. He moved to the back of the room, returning with a medical kit, a wooden basin, and clean rags. He knelt beside her. Her armor was fused and ruined on her left side, cleaved open by a weapon that had melted the metal as it cut. Gideon took his heavy shears and carefully cut away the bindings, exposing the wound. It was deep, a brutal, ragged slice just below her ribs. He poured boiling water from the kettle into the basin. He soaked a rag and began to clean the wound. The indigo blood stained his hands, feeling thicker than human blood, smelling faintly of ozone and crushed pine. He threaded a bone needle with thick gut string. His left hand, the scarred hand, trembled slightly from the cold radiating off her skin. He clamped his jaw shut, forcing his hand to steady. He sewed the torn flesh back together, pulling the stitches tight. She did not wake, but her jaw clenched hard enough that he could hear the grinding of her teeth. Even in unconsciousness, she was fighting. When the bleeding was stopped and the wound was bound tightly in white linen, Gideon stood up. He walked to the cast iron pot hanging over the fire. He ladled a thick, rich venison stew into a wooden bowl. It smelled of marrow root vegetables and survival. He brought it back to the rug. He pulled up a small wooden stool and sat beside her. He waited. He knew how trauma worked. He knew the body would eventually demand fuel. 10 minutes passed. The storm raged outside. The fire popped and hissed. Her eyes snapped open. They were not human eyes. They were a violent storm cloud gray, flecked with raw, dancing silver. There was no grogginess in them, no confusion, only pure, unfiltered survival instinct. Before Gideon could blink, she lunged. Her large violet hand shot out like a striking viper, locking around his throat. Her grip was like a steel vise. She pinned him back, her breathing heavy, her silver eyes scanning the room, assessing threats before locking onto his face. Gideon did not flinch. He did not reach for the knife on his belt. He didn't try to pry her fingers away. He simply sat there, the bowl of steaming stew perfectly balanced in his hands. He looked into her eyes. He saw the cornered animal panic beneath the warrior's rage. He saw an isolation so deep it mirrored his own. He didn't speak. He just slowly raised the wooden bowl toward her. The scent of the hot broth hit her face. Her eyes darted from his calm, weathered features to the food. The confusion in her gaze was palpable. She was waiting for the trap. She was waiting for the demand, the price of the rescue. Gideon just held the bowl steady. Slowly, the tension drained from her shoulders. Her grip on his throat loosened, her fingers sliding away. Her skin was freezing to the touch. She reached out with trembling hands and took the bowl. She didn't use the wooden spoon. She brought the rim to her lips and drank the hot stew, her eyes closing briefly as the warmth hit her stomach. She looked at him. She opened her mouth to speak. The peace shattered. The ground beneath the cabin trembled. It wasn't thunder. It was the heavy rhythmic thud of massive beasts galloping through the snow. Gideon stood up instantly. The woman Solari dropped the bowl. It clattered against the stone hearth. True terror flashed in her silver eyes. She tried to stand, reaching instinctively toward the door where her glowing sword lay, but her legs betrayed her. She collapsed back onto the rug, clutching her bleeding side. "Do not," she gasped, her voice rough, heavily accented, and carrying the weight of crushed gravel. "Run." Gideon didn't look at her. He walked to the anvil and picked up his heavy forging hammer. The heavy oak door didn't just open. It exploded. Wood splintered inward as a massive force kicked it off its iron hinges. The freezing blizzard rushed into the cabin, instantly killing the warmth of the fire. The lamps flickered and died. The only light came from the glowing coals of the forge. 5 figures stepped through the shattered doorway. They were towering giants clad in heavy, jagged obsidian armor that seemed to swallow the light. Their skin was the same dark violet as Solari's, but there was no beauty in them, only brutality. Leading them was a man whose face was a scarred landscape of cruelty. He wore a heavy cape of black fur over his spiked armor. His eyes were 4 solid black orbs. This was Valthor. He stepped into the cabin, his massive boots crushing the splintered wood. He didn't even look at Gideon. To him, the human was nothing more than a piece of furniture. His 4 black eyes locked onto Solari, who was dragging herself backward toward the stone wall. "Solari," Valthor said. His voice was a deep, resonant bass that vibrated in Gideon's chest. "You ran out of world. The bloodline ends tonight in the snow." He raised a gauntleted hand. 2 of his soldiers stepped forwards, their armor clanking. Gideon stepped into their path. He planted his boots wide. He raised the hammer. The soldier on the left didn't even draw a weapon. He simply backhanded Gideon. The blow was blindingly fast, carrying the weight of a falling tree. Gideon was thrown through the air. He crashed hard against the heavy iron anvil, his ribs screaming in agony. The hammer flew from his grim, clattering into the dark corners of the shop. He slid to the dirt floor, gasping for breath, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. The soldiers moved past him. They grabbed Solari. One seized her by her silver hair, the other by her wounded shoulder. She screamed a sound of pure defiance and agony as they dragged her across the wooden floorboards, out through the broken doorway and into the howling blizzard. Gideon forced himself to his hands and knees. The world was spinning. His chest felt like it was caving in. He coughed, spitting red blood onto the dirt. He pulled himself up using the anvil. He staggered to the ruined doorway. Outside, the storm was a white nightmare. Valthor's men stood in a circle in the snow. They held heavy torches that burned with a strange green chemical fire whipping wildly in the wind. In the center of the circle, Solari was forced to her knees. The snow around her was already turning indigo. She kept her head held high, staring up at Valthor with absolute unbroken hatred. Valthor drew his weapon. It wasn't a sword, it was an executioner's blade, a massive jagged slab of dark steel designed to sever a neck in a single blow. He stepped behind her. He raised the blade high above his head. The green firelight flickered across the snow. Gideon stood in the doorway clutching his broken ribs. The wind roared in his ears. The firelight danced in his eyes. And suddenly the snow was gone. The cold vanished. The blizzard disappeared. It was 12 years ago, the humid air of a summer night, the roaring heat of a house fire, the wooden beams collapsing. Gideon was 20 years old, standing outside the burning window of his childhood home. Inside, the flames were a wall of orange death. Through the roar of the fire, he heard his little brother screaming his name. Gideon, help me, Gideon. Gideon had stood at the window. He had felt the blistering heat melting the skin on his arms. He had looked at the flames, he had calculated the odds. A man cannot walk through fire. A man cannot survive that. He had hesitated. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The roof collapsed. A shower of sparks shot into the night sky. The screaming stopped forever. He had carried that silence every day since. He had looked at the hideous burn scars on his left hand, the hand he had finally reached it out 3 seconds too late, and hated the man he was. He had built this forge at the edge of the world to punish himself, to be alone, to never have another life depend on his broken courage. Out in the snow, Valthor's muscles tensed. The executioner's blade began its downward arc towards Solari's exposed neck. 1 second, Gideon's eyes snapped down. At his boots resting on the frozen wooden threshold lay Solari's greatsword. The alien metal was pulsing with a frantic, dying blue light. 2 seconds. Gideon didn't calculate the odds. He didn't care about the giant alien warriors. He didn't care about the laws of their world. He refused to hear the silence again. He dropped to one knee. His scarred left hand slammed onto the hilt of the glowing sword. The moment his skin made contact with the ancient steel, the world seemed to stop. The sword shrieked. It wasn't a sound that traveled through the air. It was a physical vibration that shot up Gideon's arm, rattling his teeth in his skull. The hilt burned. It wasn't the familiar, comforting heat of the forge. It was something ancient, old, and devastating. It was a magic that sought a bloodline, a vow, a soul willing to bear its crushing weight. The energy seared into the thick scar tissue of his left hand. The pain was blinding white-hot agony, but Gideon did not let go. His jaw locked. His muscles bulged. He gripped the weapon with both hands and hoisted it. The blade was impossibly heavy, yet as he swung it, the weight seemed to shift, pulling him forward, guiding his momentum. Valthor's blade descended inches from Solari's neck. Gideon launched himself from the porch. His heavy work boots dug deep into the snowdrift. He didn't swing with finesse. He didn't use a warrior's stance. He swung the massive glowing sword like a blacksmith swinging a sledgehammer, putting every ounce of his weight, his back, and his grief into the blow. He slid between Valthor and the kneeling woman. He drove the glowing blade upward. The impact sounded like a cannon firing in a canyon. The collision of the two alien metals sent a massive shockwave ripping through the clearing. The sheer concussive force blasted the falling snow outward in a perfect expanding ring, exposing the dark frozen earth beneath. Valthor, a giant of a warlord, was physically lifted off his feet and thrown backward. He crashed into the snow, his jagged executioner's blade vibrating violently in his grip. Silence slammed down on the clearing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Valthor pushed himself up, his four black eyes wide with absolute unfiltered horror. He wasn't looking at the block. He was looking at the weapon. The blue light of Solari's sword had changed. It was no longer dying. It was blazing with an intense, blinding white light. It illuminated the swirling blizzard. It illuminated Gideon standing over the fallen woman, his chest heaving, red blood dripping from his chin. Gideon's scarred hands were locked on the hilt. The ancient magic of the weapon was reacting to him. Human blood, crimson and bright, seeped from his torn knuckles, running down the steel, sinking into the alien runes etched into the blade. The runes flared crimson. Impossible, Valthor breathed, his deep voice cracking. From the back of the group of soldiers, a figure stepped forward. It was an elder wrapped in thick furs, his violet face completely covered in intricate, swirling silver tattoos. The elder took one look at the blazing sword, looked at the crimson blood sinking into the steel, and fell to his knees in the freezing snow. "The blood oath," the elder whispered. His voice was fragile, trembling with a religious terror that cut right through the storm. He caught the blade. The mortal touched the ancestral steel. Valther's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed his jagged sword at Gideon. "He is an animal. He is dirt, an outsider." "The steel does not lie, Valthor," the elder screamed, bowing his head toward the snow. "The steel has judged. It has accepted his blood. By the ancient rites forged before the stars burned out, he has claimed her life. He is the protector. He is the vanguard. He is her bound husband." Valthor stared at Gideon. Gideon didn't lower the sword. He didn't understand the words. He didn't care about the rites. He only knew that the giant in front of him wanted the woman dead, and to get to her, the giant would have to step through him. Gideon adjusted his grip, ignoring the searing pain in his scarred hand. He leveled the tip of the blazing sword directly at Valthor's chest. He didn't speak. He just waited. Valthor's chest heaved. His massive hands gripped his weapon so tightly the metal groaned. He looked from the glowing sword to the kneeling elder, to the bleeding human who stood his ground. Valthor spat a glob of dark blood into the snow. "One cycle," Valthor snarled, his voice a lethal promise. "You have one cycle of the moon, mortal. 30 days. Then the rite of combat is invoked. I will return to this miserable frozen rock. I will tear that ancestral blade from your dead broken hands. And I will take her head." Valthor turned his back. He mounted his massive armored beast. He didn't look back as he spurred the creature into the darkness. His soldiers followed, pulling the terrified elder up from the snow. Within seconds, the howling blizzard swallowed them whole. Gideon stood in the clearing for a long time. He stood there until the sound of the heavy hooves was completely gone, replaced only by the shriek of the wind through the pines. The adrenaline began to fade. The blinding white light of the sword dimmed back to a steady, calm blue pulse. The weapon suddenly felt immensely heavy. Gideon lowered the tip to the snow, leaning his weight heavily on the hilt. His broken ribs screamed. His left hand was blistering, the old scars throbbing with a new alien heat that felt permanently burned into his bones. He slowly turned around. Celeri was still on her knees in the snow. The wind whipped her silver hair across her face. She was staring up at him. Her storm gray eyes were wide. The warrior's rage was gone. In its place was a mixture of absolute awe, profound confusion, and a devastating, crushing isolation. She understood what the ancient law meant. She understood the unbreakable vow the sword had just forged between them. She realized what this fragile, broken human had just done. He had saved her life, and in doing so, he had doomed himself to face an entire empire. Gideon looked down at her. He saw the weight of a fallen world in her eyes. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't demand answers. Words were for men who had something to prove. Gideon let go of the glowing sword with his right hand. He took a step forward through the bloody snow. He reached out, offering his uninjured hand to the fallen queen. The morning arrived without sunlight, only a pale bruised gray that filtered through the heavy timber of the cabin. Gideon did not sleep. He had spent the remaining hours of the dark tearing down the splintered remains of his front door. He measured the heavy oak planks he had stored in the shed. He cut them. He planed them. He drove heavy iron nails through the crossbeams, each strike of the hammer a rhythmic grounding thud against the howling memory of the night before. He worked with a quiet, mechanical precision. It was the only way he knew how to keep the adrenaline from tearing his mind apart. By the time the new door was hung on the heavy iron hinges, barring the freezing mountain wind from the forge, the fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers. He turned around. Celeri was sitting up on the bear rug. She had not moved to the cot. She sat with her back perfectly straight against the stone of the hearth, ignoring the fresh, heavy bandages wrapped tightly around her ribs. Her storm gray eyes followed his every movement. She watched him walk to the wash basin. She watched him scrub the dried, dark blood from his scarred hands with a bristle brush and coarse lye soap. Neither of them spoke. The massive ancient sword lay on the floorboards between them, the blue light completely dormant, now looking like nothing more than a heavy slab of dark iron. But they both knew what it was. They both knew the invisible, unbreakable chain it had wrapped around their necks. Gideon dried his hands on a towel. He walked to the wood stove. He threw in 3 splits of dry birch. He set a heavy cast-iron skillet over the heat. "You should lie flat," he said. His voice was rough, unaccustomed to morning conversation. "The stitches will tear if you twist your torso." Silari did not lie down. She looked at the fresh oak door, then down at the ruined, melted pieces of her dark armor scattered near the anvil. "You possess no army," she said. Her voice was thick, grating like 2 stones grinding together. It was the voice of a commander used to echoing across blood-soaked valleys. "You have no walls, no clan, no magic." Gideon cracked 3 eggs into the sizzling bacon grease. "I have a forge. A forge will not stop Valthor." She looked at the back of his flannel shirt, at the broad, rigid set of his shoulders. "He will return in 30 of your sunrises. He will bring 100 blades. He will burn this wooden structure to ash. He will take my head, and he will take yours, human." Gideon didn't turn around. He used a flat iron spatula to flip the eggs. "Eat first, bleed later." He plated the food on thick tin dishes. He brought one to her, setting it on the floorboards within her reach. He took his own plate and sat on the heavy wooden stool near the anvil. He ate in silence. He didn't look at her for gratitude. He didn't expect any. For the next 4 days, the storm outside raged, burying the cabin under 3 feet of heavy snow. Inside, a strange, silent rhythm took hold. They did not talk of the blood oath. They did not talk of the executioner's blade. They spoke the only language 2 broken people knew how to speak without ripping their old wounds open. They spoke through the work. On the 5th day, Silari stood up. She was pale, her violet skin drawn tight over her high cheekbones, but her posture was unyielding. She watched Gideon pick up the shattered, melted pieces of her breastplate with his heavy iron tongs. He pushed them deep into the white-hot coals of the forge. He didn't know the alien metal. He didn't know its temper or its breaking point. But a blacksmith knows heat. He knows the color of steel when it yields. He pulled the glowing metal from the fire. He laid it across the anvil. He raised his heavy forging hammer. He brought it down. The metal shrieked. It resisted. Gideon struck it again. He adjusted his grip, finding the center of balance. He struck a 3rd time. The metal began to flatten. He worked for hours. The heat in the cabin grew oppressive. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His breath came in heavy, measured rhythms. He folded the strange dark steel, hammering out the impurities, reshaping the shattered plates into a solid, impenetrable curve. But the fire began to cool. The coals needed air. Before Gideon could reach for the heavy leather bellows, a shadow fell over him. Silari stepped beside the forge. She did not ask for permission. She reached up with her massive, long-fingered hands and took hold of the heavy wooden handles of the bellows. She pulled down. The leather lungs expanded, sucking in the thick cabin air. She pushed up. The bellows exhaled a roaring torrent of oxygen directly into the heart of the coals. The fire flared white-hot, casting blinding light across her sharp alien features. Gideon looked at her. She met his gaze through the shimmering heat. Her jaw was set. She nodded once. Gideon turned back to the anvil. He placed the metal in the fire. He waited for the color to turn from orange to blinding yellow. He pulled it out. He brought the hammer down. Silari pumped the bellows. Strike, breathe, strike, breathe. They fell into a flawless, unspoken synchronization. It was the rhythm of a battlefield translated to the anvil. He was the strike. She was the breath. For 3 days, they stood side by side in the blistering heat of the forge. She pushed through the agony of her torn ribs to keep the fire alive. He pushed through the exhaustion in his bones to reforge her armor. They didn't need words. Every swing of the hammer, every blast of the bellows was an acknowledgement. "I am here. You are not alone. We will not break." On the morning of the 9th day, the blizzard finally broke. The sky outside the cabin was a piercing, flawless blue. The snow stretched out in every direction, a blinding, untouched ocean of white. Gideon stepped out onto the front porch. The air was so cold, it burned his lungs. He carried a battered tin percolator in his right hand. He walked to the edge of the porch, scooped a handful of clean crystalline snow, and packed it into the pot. He walked back inside and set it directly onto the iron stove. He took a small burlap sack from the shelf. Inside were dark, oily coffee beans. He poured a handful into a leather pouch, laid it on the heavy wooden workbench, and used the flat side of his hammer to crush them. The rich, bitter, earthy smell instantly filled the cabin, masking the metallic scent of the forge. He dumped the crushed grounds into the boiling water. He let it steep until the liquid was thick, pitch black, and strong enough to strip paint. He poured it into 2 chipped enamel mugs. He walked over to the hearth. Solari was sitting there carefully polishing the newly forged plates of her armor with an oiled rag. The dark metal was smooth now, seamless, lacking the intricate alien engravings it once had, but carrying the heavy, brutal practicality of Gideon's craft. He stopped in front of her. He held out one of the mugs. She looked at the steaming black liquid. She looked up at him. "It is fuel," Gideon said quietly, "for the cold." Solari set the rag aside. She reached out and took the mug. Her hands dwarfed the small tin cup. She brought it to her face, sniffing it cautiously. Her silver eyebrows drew together in deep suspicion. She took a sip. She froze. Her eyes widened. Her violet skin seemed to pale. Without a word, she turned her head, leaned past the heavy oak door frame, and spat the mouthful of coffee directly into the snowbank outside. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, staring at the mug in absolute horror. "This is not fuel," she rasped, coughing slightly. "This is a weapon. You have boiled the dirt from the ground and called it water. You drink poison by choice." Gideon stood there. He looked at the black stain in the pristine white snow. He looked back at her deeply offended expression. The corner of his mouth twitched. He took a long, slow sip from his own mug, letting the bitter heat wash over his tongue. He swallowed. "Builds character," he said deadpan. Solari stared at him. She looked at his completely straight face. She looked at the horrific black liquid in her cup. And then something broke. A sound started deep in her chest. It was a low, rumbling vibration. It climbed up her throat and spilled out into the quiet cabin. It was a laugh. It wasn't a delicate sound. It was rough, gravelly, and entirely unguarded. It was the laugh of a woman who had forgotten how to make the sound years ago. Her shoulders shook. The tension that had held her spine rigid since the moment she crashed through his door completely shattered. She laughed at the bitter drink. She laughed at the absurdity of the tiny tin cup in her giant hands. She laughed at the grim, silent human who stood before her drinking mud as if it were fine wine. Gideon watched her. The lines of exhaustion and fury vanished from her face. In the morning light, with the fire crackling behind her and the genuine sound of her joy filling the room, the terrifying alien warlord disappeared. She was just a woman, a beautiful, weary woman sharing a quiet morning at the end of the world. He didn't smile, but the heavy, rusted iron bands around his chest loosened just a fraction. He pulled up his stool and sat beside her. She didn't drink the rest of the coffee, but she didn't throw it away. She held the warm tin between her hands, letting the steam rise into her silver hair. The silence between them changed after that. It was no longer the tense silence of 2 cornered animals. It was the comfortable silence of 2 soldiers sharing a trench. But trenches are always cold in the end. 3 nights later, the true winter came. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. The wind died completely, leaving a deep freezing stillness that seeped straight through the cabin logs. Gideon built the fire as high as he dared, but the cold crept across the floorboards like creeping frost. Gideon sat at the workbench. Only a single oil lamp burned. He was trying to sketch a new hilt for her massive sword. The old one was cracked from the impact of his strike against Valthor. But his hand wouldn't work. The deep, biting cold had settled into the ruined tissue of his left hand. The scars contracted, pulling his fingers into a rigid, agonizing claw. He dropped the charcoal pencil. He gripped his left wrist with his right hand, gritting his teeth as a sharp phantom fire raced up his forearm. He closed his eyes. He breathed through his nose. He tried to force the muscles to unknot. "Gideon, help me." The memory of the flames flashed behind his eyelids. The smell of burning pine. The screaming. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, his breath coming in short, sharp hisses. A shadow fell over the workbench. He didn't open his eyes until he felt it. A hand, massive and smooth, covered his ruined, trembling fist. Solari stood beside him. She didn't say a word. She simply reached out and enveloped his scarred hand in both of hers. Her skin was naturally cooler than a human's, but right now it didn't feel cold. It felt grounding. Beneath her touch, a strange sensation began to spread. It wasn't heat. It was a deep, resonant hum, like the vibration of a heavy cello string. The alien energy in her blood seeped into his skin, sinking deep into the damaged nerves, unraveling the tight, agonizing knots of muscle and scar tissue. The pain slowly began to recede. The phantom flames died down. Gideon opened his eyes. He looked at his hand entirely swallowed by hers. He looked up at her face. She was looking at the terrible white scars that wrapped around his knuckles. There was no pity in her storm gray eyes, only an ancient quiet understanding. "The fire did not want you," she said softly. Gideon stared at the oil lamp. He didn't pull his hand away. "No," he said. His voice was hollow. "It wanted him." He had never spoken the words aloud. Not to the doctors, not to the military shrinks, not to the priests. But here in the freezing dark, anchored by the impossible touch of a woman from the stars, the iron vault in his chest cracked open. "I was 20, Gideon said to the flickering flame. "He was 10, my brother." He stopped. The silence stretched. Solari did not push. She just held his hand, keeping the cold away. The house went up in the middle of the night. Faulty wiring. By the time I woke up, the hallway was a wall of orange. I got out the window. I thought he was behind me. Gideon swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. He wasn't. He was trapped in his room. I ran to his window. I could hear him. I could see him through the smoke. I just had to reach in. I just had to dive through the frame and grab him. Gideon looked down at his ruined left hand resting gently between Solari's long fingers. "I hesitated," he whispered. "The heat it was breathing. I looked at the fire and I froze. 3 seconds. That's all it took. I stood there for 3 seconds and the roof collapsed. When I finally reached my hand in to grab him, there was nothing left to grab, just falling timber. It burned the skin off my arm, but it didn't take the guilt." He slowly pulled his hand back. He rested it flat on the wooden table. The shaking had stopped. "You don't know who you made a blood oath with, Solari," he said bitterly. "You think the sword chose a protector. It didn't. It chose a coward. I act without thinking now because the last time I stopped to think, I let a child burn to death." The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow outside. Solari looked at the man sitting before her. She saw the gray in his hair. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She saw a man who had built a prison of iron and isolation to punish himself for a sin he could not outrun. She stepped closer. The physical distance between them, maintained so carefully for the past 2 weeks, vanished. She sat on the edge of the workbench beside him. Slowly, deliberately, she rested the side of her head against his broad shoulder. Gideon went perfectly still. The contact was shocking. She was a warrior of a brutal world, an alien species, a towering figure of violence. Yet as she leaned her weight against him, she felt incredibly fragile. "You judge yourself by the seconds you lost," she said, her voice a low murmur against his flannel shirt. "Not by the years you have suffered to repay them." She closed her eyes. "You asked why Valthor hunts me." She continued, staring into the dark corners of the forge. "You think this is a dispute over land, over a throne. It is not." Gideon turned his head slightly. The scent of her hair was like a sudden winter storm passing through a pine forest. "Who are you, Solari?" "I am the last," she whispered. She lifted her head, meeting his eyes. The vulnerability in her gaze was devastating. "My family, the vanguard of the Silver Peak, were the keepers of the old laws. We did not conquer. We maintained the balance. For 10,000 years, my bloodline was the shield that kept the violent clans from destroying our world." Her jaw tightened. The grief in her eyes was a mirror to his own. "Valthor did not defeat us in battle. He poisoned the wells of our mountain fortress. He waited until the children were sick, until the elders could not stand. Then his obsidian armor marched through our gates." She looked down at her massive hands. Hands built to wield a giant sword. Hands that were currently trembling. "I was leading a patrol in the northern valleys. When I returned, the snow was no longer white. It was indigo. My father, my brothers, my sisters, everyone, slaughtered in their beds." Her voice broke. She forced it back into iron. "I am the last drop of vanguard blood in the universe, Gideon. If I die, the balance is gone forever. Valthor will drown our world in endless war. He hunted me across the stars. He drove me into the dirt of your world." She reached out and touched the ancient sword leaning against the anvil. This blade was forged by the first of my ancestors. It recognizes the soul. When you grabbed the hilt, it did not see a coward. It saw a man who would step into the fire. She looked back at him, her gray eyes burning with fierce, absolute conviction. You saved my life. And by saving me, you placed a target on your own chest. Valthor will not stop. He cannot allow you to live because, as long as the blood oath binds us, my bloodline survives through you. You are the shield now. Gideon stared at her. The weight of her words settled over him, heavier than the anvil, heavier than the winter snow. He wasn't just protecting a woman. He was protecting an entire species' last hope for peace. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the freezing night. The stars were brilliant, cold, and unforgiving. 30 days. Valthor had promised 30 days. Half of that time was already gone. He's coming back, Gideon said, his voice flat, devoid of panic. Yes, Solari said quietly from the shadows behind him. With an army. Gideon looked down at his hands, at the thick calluses, at the burn scars, at the hands that knew only how to break things down and build them back stronger. Good, Gideon said. He turned around. The rusted iron in his chest was gone. In its place was a furnace burning white hot. Let him come. Day 30 arrived without a sunrise. The sky over the Cascades was the color of a cold iron anvil. Gideon did not light the forge. He sat in the dark. The cabin was freezing, but he did not feel it. He was dressed in his heavy canvas work pants, his steel-toed boots, and his thick, scarred, leather blacksmith's apron. It was the only armor he owned. Across his knees lay the vanguard sword. It was quiet now, the blue light reduced to a faint, steady pulse against his thighs. Solari stood by the window. She wore the dark armor Gideon had reforged. It fit her perfectly. There were no ornate engravings left, only the smooth, brutal efficiency of human craftsmanship. She looked like a shadow carved from stone. The silence between them was not tense. It was the silence of a loaded gun. Then the dogs began to bark. It started at the edge of the valley, a frantic, terrified howling that swept through the distant timberline. Gideon stood up. He walked to the heavy oak door and slid the iron bolt back. He stepped out onto the porch. His breath plumed white in the bitter air. He expected the giant alien beasts. He expected Valthor's obsidian armor. He did not expect the torches. Down the winding mountain road, a line of flickering orange light was moving toward the cabin. It was not a disciplined military march. It was a chaotic, shuffling mass. As they drew closer, the morning gloom revealed their faces. It was the town. Gideon gripped the porch rail. The wood groaned under his scarred hand. He recognized them all. Miller the grocer, whose wagon axle Gideon had welded in the dead of winter for free. Henderson, the logger, who owed his right leg to the tourniquet Gideon had applied 3 summers ago. Dozens of them. Men he had drank with, men whose tools he had sharpened, men whose roofs he had helped raise. They were armed. Shotguns, hunting rifles, axes. They stopped 20 yards from the porch. They looked at the ground. They looked at the trees. They looked everywhere except at Gideon's face. The crowd parted. Mayor Higgins stepped forward. He was a soft man wrapped in an expensive wool coat, shivering from the cold and from cowardice. He held a megaphone, but his hands shook so badly he barely got it to his mouth. Gideon, Higgins called out. His voice cracked, echoing off the pines. We know what you've got in there. Gideon said nothing. He just stood on the porch, a dark silhouette against the unlit forge. They came in the night, Higgins stammered, wiping sweat from his freezing forehead. Monsters, giants. They surrounded the town. They said they will burn every house to the foundation. They will kill the children. Unless we hand over the alien woman. Solari stepped out onto the porch behind Gideon. The crowd gasped. A few men raised their rifles, their hands trembling on the triggers. Solari did not flinch. She looked down at the mob with an expression of profound, exhausted pity. Gideon, please, Miller yelled from the middle of the pack. You brought this on us. You brought this war here. Give her up. We have families. Gideon looked at Miller. He remembered the man's children playing in the dirt outside his shop. He remembered the long, quiet nights he had spent believing that this town was his sanctuary. He had built their plows. He had shod their horses. He had bled for them. And at the first sign of fire, they had come to feed him to the flames. You have 30 seconds, Gideon said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the heavy crushing weight of a falling tree. To get off my land. We outnumber you 50-1, Gideon. Higgins shrieked, his fear turning into desperate anger. We will tear that cabin down board by board. Do not make us do this. Gideon reached behind the door frame. He did not pull out a gun. He pulled out his heavy forging hammer. The head was solid blackened steel. The handle was hickory-stained dark with years of sweat and oil. He stepped off the porch. He walked down the wooden stairs. His boots crunched in the hard-packed snow. He walked straight toward the mob. He didn't raise the hammer. He just walked. His rusted earth eyes were locked on Higgins. The crowd shifted. The men in the front row took a step back. Then another. The rifles wavered. They were looking at a man who had walked through literal fire. They were looking at a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Gideon stopped 10 feet from the mayor. Shoot me, Gideon said quietly. Higgins swallowed hard. His finger trembled on the trigger guard of his hunting rifle. Shoot me, Tom. Gideon repeated, his voice dropping to a low, lethal gravel. But understand this. If you pull that trigger, you better kill me. Because if I draw breath when I hit the snow, I am going to take this hammer and I am going to shatter every bone in your hands. And then I am going to look for Miller. The silence was absolute. The wind stopped blowing. No one moved. No one breathed. The townspeople looked at the blacksmith and they realized the terrible truth. They were willing to sacrifice a stranger to save themselves, but none of them were willing to die for it. The cowardice broke them. Higgins lowered the rifle. He looked at the snow. He turned his back and walked away. One by one, the rest of the town followed. They left their torches burning in the snowdrifts. They left their honor in the dirt. Gideon watched them go. His face was a mask of carved stone. They are afraid, Solari said softly from the porch. Fear doesn't make you betray your own, Gideon said without turning around. It just reveals that you always would. The ground beneath his boots began to vibrate. It was a deep, rhythmic tremor. It knocked the snow from the pine needles. It rattled the tin cups inside the cabin. The townspeople at the end of the road began to scream. They scattered like flushed quail, diving into the tree line, abandoning the road entirely. Through the morning fog, a massive shape emerged. It was a beast of war, heavily armored in dark iron, its breath pluming in thick clouds of steam. Upon its back sat Valthor. Behind him marched 24 vanguard soldiers in full obsidian plate. They moved with terrifying mechanical precision. They did not shout. They did not chant. They simply marched, a tide of dark violence coming to claim its prize. Valthor halted his beast at the edge of Gideon's property. He looked at the discarded torches left by the fleeing townsfolk. A cruel, jagged smile stretched across his scarred violet face. Your world is weak, mortal. Valthor's bass voice boomed across the clearing. Your own kind abandons you. They crawl on their bellies to spare their miserable lives. And you stand alone in the snow. Gideon turned his head. He looked back at the porch. Solari walked down the stairs. She carried the vanguard sword. The ancient blade was pulsing now, sensing the enemy casting a brilliant blue aura against her silver hair. She walked through the snow and stopped at Gideon's right shoulder. She planted the tip of the massive sword into the frozen earth. He is not alone, Solari said. Her voice was not a shout. It was a vow. Valthor's 4 black eyes narrowed. He dismounted his beast. The ground shook as his boots hit the dirt. He drew his executioner's blade. The dark steel hummed with a sick green energy. The 30 days are over, Valthor snarled. The blood oath demands a conclusion. A trial of combat. No armies, no interference. You and me human, until the snow turns black. Gideon didn't reply. He took off his flannel jacket, tossing it into the snow. He stood in the freezing air in a thin gray thermal shirt and his heavy leather apron. He flexed his left hand. The terrible burn scars pulled tight, but they did not tremble. Solari's touch had healed the deep nerve damage. The hand was steady. He reached out. Solari lifted the vanguard sword and placed the hilt in his waiting grip. The moment his skin touched the metal, the blade erupted. The blue light shifted instantly to a blinding, furious white. The heat radiating from the steel warmed Gideon's face. It felt like the heart of the forge. It felt like home. In his right hand, he held the glowing alien sword. In his left, he held his hickory-handled forging hammer. Valthor laughed. It was a sound like grinding boulders. A hammer, you bring a craftsman's tool to a warlord's duel. Gideon stepped forward into the open clearing. I'm a blacksmith, he said quietly. I fix broken things. He leveled the blazing sword at Valthor. And I break things that can't be fixed. Valthor charged. He moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He crossed the 20 yards in 3 colossal strides. He swung the executioner's blade in a horizontal arc designed to cut Gideon in half. Gideon didn't try to block it. He knew the physics of weight and momentum. Blocking a mountain would shatter his arms. He dropped to one knee, letting the green glowing steel shear the air inches above his head. The wind of the swing nearly knocked him over. As Valthor's momentum carried him forward, Gideon pivoted. He swung the vanguard sword upward, aiming for the joints in Valthor's obsidian armor. The white blade connected with the dark plating. Sparks showered like fireworks. The armor held, but the kinetic force sent Valthor stumbling sideways. Valthor roared, spinning around and bringing his weapon down in an overhead smash. Gideon raised the vanguard sword at an angle. The two blades clashed. The sound was deafening, the sonic boom that cracked the ice on the cabin windows. Gideon's boots sank 2 inches into the frozen mud. His knees buckled under the impossible weight, but he held the angle. He let Valthor's blade slide down his own, redirecting the force into the ground. Valthor was a master of alien martial arts. He fought with centuries of technique. He unleashed a flurry of strikes, a terrifying combination of power and precision. Gideon fought like a man trying to survive a house fire. He gave ground. He took glancing blows. The edge of Valthor's gauntlet caught Gideon's jaw, snapping his head back and sending a spray of red blood across the snow. The flat of the alien blade slammed into Gideon's ribs, cracking bone and knocking the breath from his lungs. Gideon staggered backward, gasping, tasting copper. The soldiers surrounding the clearing began to pound their weapons against their shields. A rhythmic, deafening death knell. Solari took a step forward, her hands balled into fists, her eyes wide with terror. Gideon held up his left hand, the hand holding the hammer. He didn't look back at her. Stay back! Valthor circled him, sneering. You have heart, human, but heart does not forge empires. Strength does. Magic does. You are just meat. Gideon spat blood into the snow. He breathed in the freezing air. His ribs screamed, but his mind was completely terrifyingly calm. He wasn't looking at Valthor's eyes. He wasn't looking at the alien magic. He was looking at Valthor's sword. A warrior looks at the edge of a weapon to see where it will cut. A blacksmith looks at the core of a weapon to see how it was made. Throughout the brutal exchange, Gideon had been listening. He had been feeling the vibrations traveling down the vanguard sword every time the blades clashed. He had been watching the sparks. Valthor's blade was massive. It was coated in dark magic. But beneath the magic, it was just steel. And Gideon knew steel better than he knew his own name. He noticed the microfractures. He noticed that the green energy flickered violently near the lower third of the blade when it struck hard. He heard the pitch of the ring. It was a dead, flat sound. The blade had been quenched incorrectly. The alien smith who forged it had cooled it too fast to lock in the magic. The edge was diamond hard, but the core was brittle. It was a fatal structural flaw hidden beneath centuries of dark sorcery. Gideon wiped his chin. He straightened his back. He gripped the heavy hickory handle of his hammer. Your sword is a lie, Gideon said. Valthor stopped pacing. What? It's over-tempered, Gideon said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. Too much carbon, cooled too fast. It looks terrifying, but it got no soul. It's glass waiting for a stone. Valthor's face contorted with supreme insult. I will mount your skull on my saddle. He charged again. He raised the massive executioner's blade for a final devastating overhead strike. He poured all his dark magic, all his physical strength into the blow. It was a strike meant to shatter Gideon's guard and cleave him to the sternum. Gideon didn't dodge. He didn't retreat. He stepped directly into the path of the falling blade. He raised the glowing vanguard sword horizontally above his head, gripping it with both hands, locking his elbows. He created a solid, immovable bar of white-hot steel. Valthor's blade came down like a meteor. It struck the center of the vanguard sword. The impact drove Gideon to his knees. The ground beneath him spider-webbed with cracks. The pain in his shoulders was blinding, tearing muscle and straining tendons to their absolute limit. But the vanguard sword held. It did not break. It acted exactly as Gideon intended. It acted as the anvil. Valthor's blade was locked against it, vibrating violently, the green magic flaring in resistance. Valthor pressed down, roaring in triumph, believing he had crushed the human's defense. Gideon let go of the Vanguard sword with his left hand. The sword remained balanced on his right arm, pinned by Valthor's immense pressure. Gideon brought his left arm down. He grabbed the hickory handle of his forging hammer from his belt. He didn't swing at Valthor. He didn't aim for flesh or bone. He aimed for the exact spot on Valthor's blade where the dead ring originated. The lower third, the brittle core. Gideon engaged his core, his back, his heavily scarred left arm. He channeled 30 years of striking hot iron, 30 years of solitary anger, 30 years of seeking redemption. He swung the blacksmith's hammer upward in a brutal, perfect arc. The solid steel head of the hammer slammed into the flat side of Valthor's locked blade. Physics is universal. It does not care about magic. It does not care about warlords. When absolute kinetic force meets a brittle core, trapped against an immovable anvil, there is only one outcome. Crack. The sound was not a metallic clang. It was the sound of a glacier breaking apart. Valthor's executioner's blade shattered. It didn't just break in half, it exploded. Shards of dark corrupted steel and violent green energy blasted outward in a deadly shrapnel storm. Valthor was thrown backwards, screaming as the backfire of his own magic ripped through his gauntlets. He collapsed into the snow, smoking his hands empty. The heavy silence returned. The soldiers surrounding the clearing froze, their shields lowering. Their warlord's ancestral weapon had just been destroyed by a man in a leather apron using a tool meant for shaping horseshoes. Gideon stood up slowly. His joints popped, his ribs burned. He let the forging hammer drop to the dirt. He gripped the hilt of the Vanguard sword with both hands. The white light was serene now, steady and dominant. He walked over to Valthor. The giant was on his back, staring at his empty, smoking hands in absolute disbelief. Gideon placed the blazing tip of the Vanguard sword against Valthor's throat. The heat singed the alien's fur cape. "Yield," Gideon commanded. His voice was a quiet rasp, but it echoed like thunder. Valthor looked up at the human. He looked at the rusted earth eyes that held no fear, only an immovable, heavy truth. By the laws of his people, a shattered blade was a shattered soul. He had been defeated in single combat. The rights were absolute. Valthor slowly lowered his head back into the snow. He closed his four eyes. "I yield," the warlord choked out. Gideon did not smile. He didn't gloat. He pulled the sword back. He turned his back on the most dangerous being in the galaxy and walked away. He walked to the edge of the clearing where Solari stood. She was staring at him, her chest heaving. She looked at his bruised, bleeding face. She looked at the destroyed weapon of her greatest enemy. "You won," she whispered as if she couldn't believe the words. "You broke the siege. You saved the bloodline. Why would you risk everything for a throne you do not want?" Gideon stopped in front of her. He reached out with his scarred left hand. He gently touched the side of her face, his calloused thumb brushing against her high violet cheekbone. "I didn't fight for a throne," Gideon said softly. "I don't care about the Vanguard. I don't care about the stars." He looked deep into your storm gray eyes. "I fought for the woman who drank my terrible coffee," he said. "I fought because I finally found something I refused to lose." Solari's breath hitched. A single tear, shining silver in the morning light, spilled over her lashes. She leaned into his scarred hand. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She reached up, grabbed the collar of his thermal shirt, and pulled him down. The kiss was desperate, bruised and tasting of copper and snow. It was a promise forged in the heat of survival. It was two isolated islands colliding and forming a continent. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots retreating echoed into the mountains. Valthor and his army were leaving. The blood oath was fulfilled. The law bound them to exile. Gideon and Solari broke apart. They looked down the mountain road. At the edge of the tree line, Mayor Higgins and the townspeople had returned. They stood in the shadows of the pines, watching. They had seen the human defeat the monster. They had seen the impossible magic. Higgins took a hesitant step forward. He raised a hand, opening his mouth to speak, to apologize, to invite the hero back into the fold. Gideon looked at the man. He felt nothing. No anger, no betrayal, just a profound, heavy emptiness. Gideon turned his back on the town. He walked into the cabin. Silari followed. "We can't stay here," Gideon said, wiping the blood from his jaw with a rag. "They are your people," Silari said quietly, watching him from the doorway. "You saved them. They will revere you now." "They aren't my people," Gideon replied, tossing the rag into the cold hearth. "They only respect the monster that killed the bigger monster. The first time the winter gets too hard, they'll look at me and remember how terrified they were. A community built on fear isn't a home. It's just a crowded prison." He walked to the back room. He pulled out two heavy canvas packs. "We pack the tools," Gideon said, tossing her a bag. "We pack the winter gear. We leave the rest." Silari caught the bag. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. The heavy weight of her royal lineage seemed to melt away, leaving only the woman beneath. "Where do we go?" she asked. "North," Gideon said, picking up his forging hammer and slipping it through his leather belt. "Deep timber. Past the logging roads. Past the maps. We find a river. We build a new fire." By noon, the cabin was empty. The forge was cold. Gideon and Silari walked into the dense pine forest, leaving the town, the cowardice, and the ghost behind them. They walked side by side, their shoulders brushing. The massive alien sword was strapped to Gideon's back, wrapped in heavy canvas. They did not look back. 2 years later, the spring thaw was running fast in the deep northern woods. The river roared with ice melt, carving through a valley that had never seen a mapmaker's pen. At the edge of the water stood a new cabin. It was larger than the old one, built from massive cedar logs. Smoke curled lazily from a wide stone chimney. Outside, the steady, rhythmic ring of a hammer against an anvil echoed through the trees. Gideon stood at an open-air forge. He was bare-chested in the crisp spring air, his muscles corded and thick with labor. The gray in his hair had spread, but his rusted earth eyes were clear. The heavy shadows that had haunted him for a decade were gone. He pulled a glowing horseshoe from the coals. He laid it on the anvil. His scarred left hand held the tongs with absolute stability. The heavy oak door of the cabin swung open. Silari stepped out onto the porch. She wore a simple, heavy linen dress. Her silver hair was braided down her back. The harshness of the warrior had softened into a quiet, immense strength. In her arms, she held a child. The boy was a year old. His skin was a pale, dusty twilight, a perfect blend of human pink and vanguard violet. He had a shock of bright silver hair. But when he opened his eyes to look at the bright spring morning, they were not alien black nor storm gray. They were the color of rusted earth. Human eyes. Gideon lowered his hammer. He wiped his brow. He looked across the clearing at his wife and his son. The boy saw him and let out a high ringing laugh, reaching his tiny, pale violet hands toward the sound of the forge. Silari smiled. It was a smile that could have ended wars. She walked down the steps and crossed the grass, bringing the child to the man. Gideon set his tools down. He wiped his hands meticulously on his apron. He reached out and took the boy from her arms. The child immediately grabbed Gideon's nose, giggling furiously. Gideon pulled his family close. He buried his face in Silari's silver hair, smelling the pine and the wood smoke. He felt the strong, steady heartbeat of his son against his chest. There were no crowds here. No townsmen to appease. No ancient thrones to reclaim. Gideon looked back at the fire burning bright in the forge. He had lost his brother to the flames. He had lost his world to his own grief. But he had not given up. He had taken the broken pieces of his life, and he had forged something new. Something unbreakable. The hammer fell silent. The forest was peaceful. The blacksmith had finally built a home.